these techniques. Like I know on my guitar, we have a like torrefied top. Anything you want to mention about any of those sort of new techniques that you're
Sure.
using?
Yeah, no, and the Torified top's probably a great place to start because, um, again, I don't consider myself having built that, being a builder for that long. It's still less than 20 years, and yet there have been a lot of changes even in the past 15 or 20 years. And Torified tops are one of those things that just weren't around when I started, but over the past 5 years especially have become quite popular. So um, you see Torified tops on lots of luthier built instruments, and most of the factories now are offering a Torified top model. And if people aren't familiar with that, the term Torified or the torrification process, it's a wood stabilization process that involves cooking the wood in a special furnace, but it's a lot more than just heating the wood up. So you can't just stick the wood in your oven and expect to get a torrified top, but they actually control the amount of oxygen that's in the environment of the oven while they're cooking it. And depending on what type of wood they're dealing with and what result they're looking for, they'll use a different formulas for the torrification. And the biggest market for torrified wood is actually the decking industry. So like outdoor wood products, because when the wood is torrified, it's stabilized. It becomes a lot more resistant to water, to damage from termites and those sorts of things. And so I don't know how it made its way into the instrument world, but somewhere along the line, someone looked at what was being done and noticed that this torrified wood has kind of the properties that we look for. And we're always looking for ways to stabilize the instruments, especially acoustic guitars, where you're dealing with a lot of very thin pieces of wood that are typically very susceptible to humidity and temperature. Anything you can do to stabilize the wood is generally a good thing. And so, yeah, the result of a torrified top, I've heard some people liken it to air drying a top for like 80 years. So it's the stabilization process just means that the torrified top is not going to absorb or release moisture the way a regular top would. So it's going to be less susceptible to humidity damage. And they tend to have that kind of vintage style sound, just a very clear, rich tone, which again suits vintage style guitars, which is a lot of what I build. And so I've been very happy with the results I've got. I use Torified Sitka spruce and Adirondack spruce. Your guitar has the Adirondack on the top, but either of those options tend to sound great. But it's become quite popular to the point where almost half the guitars I build now have these torrified tops. And some of the other features, I guess I can just kind of run through some of them quickly, that most of these things are not things you see on the outside of the guitar, but early on in my building career, I was meeting a lot of full-time musicians that would travel a lot. We have a great Celtic music festival here in town, and so I was meeting a lot of European musicians and actually building instruments for some of them. And what I found is that a lot of these folk musicians, they would be traveling to different climates. They'd be playing, an indoor show at a bar where there's air conditioning, and then an hour later they're going outside in ultra humid conditions to play a stage. And so I began to look for some techniques to help just stabilize the guitars so that the guitar is not going through shock every time it goes through one of these big humidity swings. So that the Torified tops have been part of that, certainly contribute to a stable instrument. But other things include like carbon fiber neck reinforcement. So my necks have a piece of carbon fiber on either side of the two-way truss rod. And the carbon fiber doesn't prevent the truss rod from working normally, but what I find by adding the carbon fiber is that it kind of helps the neck stay put. So I can adjust the amount of relief in the neck, and it's more likely to stay in that place, even if the instrument is exposed to swings and humidity. And one of the other things on that topic is on the inside of my guitars, I typically put a very thin layer of shellac. Again, that's not totally original to me, but it's not super common. But if the shellac is thin enough, and if it's the right type, it will still allow the wood to breathe, but it really slows down the rate at which the wood releases and absorbs moisture. So that, again, if the instrument is taken through huge humidity swings, it's not going to go into shock and, you know, either swell up or shrink rapidly. It kind of allows the instrument to gradually adjust to its surroundings, and just helps keeps it stable. So yeah, and apart from that, like I guess one of the I can kind of flip back and forth between some of the modern and some of the vintage stuff I've been incorporating, but there's a real movement, or yeah, I guess among modern guitar builders, to stiffen up the rim of the guitar. And the belief is that by stiffening the rim of the guitar, so that's the sides, what it does is it allows more of the string energy to stay on the top of the guitar instead of going down the sides of the instrument. And more energy in the top should equal more tone and more volume. And so there's different ways of achieving an instrument with an ultra stiff rim. I use some solid liners around the top with some side bracing. Other builders are using double sides or a few other new techniques, but the ultra stiff rim, again, it contributes to the life of the instrument, just helping it keep its shape. You know, guitars want to collapse. There's 160 to 180 pounds of pressure, depending on your strings, trying to fold your guitar in half the whole time. So anything that can be done to counteract that is going to prolong the life of your instrument. So that's something that I incorporate into all my instruments is an ultra stiff rim. The bracing on my guitars is just another thing I could mention. I typically use a symmetrical double X bracing pattern, which I've used for many years now, and I tweak the pattern a little bit based on what shape I'm building. But what I find with using this bracing pattern is it tends to produce very balanced sounding instruments, which is something that I've always been going for, mainly for fingerstyle. So not too heavy on the bass, but kind of a nice even sound across the tonal spectrum. And so that is my typical bracing pattern. But as I do continue to dive into kind of the vintage side of things, I am getting requests for again, whether it's a Martin style pattern or a Gibson style pattern. So that is becoming an option on my instruments, and something that you'll probably see in the next year or two, where, you know, clients will have the option to pick. Do they want kind of the traditional house guitars bracing pattern, or do you want something more vintage styled? And kind of probably the last thing I should mention along the features line is that I do build with hide glue. That's one of the biggest questions I get asked. Do you use hide glue? And I do use hide glue in the construction of my instruments. And that's kind of one of the advantages to being a small shop luthier and not having to mass produce, is that hide glue and that family of glues is not conducive to a production environment, which is why you know, Martin has what they call their Authentic series, which is built with hide glue, and they charge several $1,000s more for an Authentic series instrument, based on the fact that it's a lot of extra work. But for someone like myself, it's not that much extra work to incorporate a feature like hide glue, and So that's something I do because I do believe it contributes to a good sounding instrument.
Yeah, so with all of these sort of like special features, I know that at Paramount we've been selling a lot of your guitars recently, and people are realizing how special these are. So I know we've been pretty busy with building guitars for Paramount. So what does a typical day in your workshop look like?
Um, I like to start early. So that's one of the biggest things for me is I tend to get up really early compared to most people I know and just get out to the shop. And I find that that gives me generally 3 to 4 to 5 good hours of work before the phone starts to ring. Um, and I typically build guitars in small batches of anywhere between 2 and 4 instruments. Again, depending on what I'm currently working on, but I'll focus on whatever instruments are on the go, and I take a batch of guitars and I move it through until I get to the finishing process, at which point I'll start a new batch of guitars while the finish is drawing on one batch. So every day I'm gluing a few pieces or shaping a few pieces on each guitar that's in the batch, and moving it through the process. And the build time for me, typically 3 to 4 months is fairly standard to move a small batch of guitars through the process. But the 3 to 4 months is not my wait time. That's just the build time. So once the build actually starts, it's then a 3 to 4 month process before it's completed.